Okay, I think we're going to jump in for the sake of time. I know other folks will be joining us as we get into our conversation, but let me start by saying a genuine welcome and thank you for joining us on this conversation on racial equity and what it means in this moment to be advancing change from the inside out in federal government. My name is Glenn Harris. I'm president of Race Forward. And as we start today's webinar, I'm feeling a little humbled and inspired. This month is the 60th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington. It was 60 years ago that over a 250,000 community leaders, union organizers, and clergy issued a call for action for our nation. The organizers served in roles that were external to the federal government, demanding change from the institutions in our lives, and they inspired outcomes that have had a lasting national impact. Today, community leaders are still speaking up, organizing, trying to encourage racial equity in government and in institutions that impact our lives. But unlike 60 years ago, civil servants within federal government are now working to center racial equity. This is a welcomed and historic change, and we've never seen an inside-outside strategy like this before. Within the past 2 years, the federal government has demonstrated how a racial equity agenda that is executed with intentional planning as well as implementation can strengthen our democracy while yielding benefits for everyone in America. This is a clear instance of changing the parameters, the imagination of what is possible within government. Although today's webinar coincides with the national milestone of the March on Washington, just like then, our dialogue today is focused on a call to action, because we all know there's still much work to be done. We will not achieve a true democracy without racial justice, and we will not achieve racial justice without a real democracy. They are inextricably linked. Going forward, federal civil servants will need to organize themselves. Federal agencies and departments hold immense influence to set the tone of the nation and are poised to lead our country towards an equitable future. During our 60-minute webinar, we will explore and elevate the equity-oriented work of federal institutions. Our discussants will clarify how sustained strategies inside and outside public institutions are creating real outcomes with accountability. Finally, this webinar focuses on what is possible when leaders within our federal institutions fully lean into, identify, and remove barriers while embracing the charge of advancing racial equity. I'm joined today by Carlton Neely, our Senior Director for Federal Strategies at Race Forward. He will be joined in conversation with Matthew Tejada, Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Environmental Justice at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And we will have a conversation also with Janice Fowler, Counselor to the Secretary for Racial Equity at the U.S. Department of Treasury. But first, it is my pleasure to be in conversation with Jenny Yang, Deputy Assistant to the President for Racial Justice and Equity with the White House Domestic Policy Council. Jenny, I just want to start out by just saying thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Glenn. I think here we go. Great to be here with you all. Really terrific to be part of this conversation.
We are excited to have you. I wanted to start out by leaning into where I started. You know, in the years since 1963, we know that it's been primarily citizens and community organizations who responded to that call for action. But in 2023, unlike past years, we now have the executive branch of the federal government joined in responding to this call for action with a real focus on racial equity. I guess my first question for you is just, what type of reception is the administration receiving on its position on racial equity across the country? And where do you see the greatest opportunity in this work in this moment, in your opinion?
Well, thank you, Glenn, for your recognition that 60 years after the March on Washington, we are in a different place today, both because of the progress we've made and because the federal government has made it a day one priority to undertake a whole of government approach to advance racial equity. President Biden has called on the entire federal government to make it a priority to serve all communities and remove systemic barriers to opportunity. And state and local governments have been particularly critical partners in this work. And I'll share a few examples where we have seen tremendous progress. And one comes from our interim American Rescue Plan Equity Report that we released last year. We saw that state and local governments really stepped up to use those funds in ways that built on these federal efforts to prioritize equity. So, for example, to address disparities in communities hardest hit by the pandemic, over 380 state, local, and tribal governments used this coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund by the end of 2021. And we saw that these governments planned nearly 1,500 projects to invest in affordable housing, quality education, and public health to better serve communities most vulnerable to COVID-19. And as you know from your participation, Glenn, we held our first ever White House convening on equity this May, where we heard from 3 community leaders from LA County, Buffalo, New York, and the National Congress of American Indians on how our partnerships with state, local, and tribal governments have spurred the most equitable recovery in memory. And we know that while the government can be a force multiplier for change, we need the ideas and sustained collaboration from all corners of society to answer the call to action from the March. And what we learned so far in this administration is that sustained engagement with community-driven organizations is critical to advance racial equity. So, I'll talk some more about the EEO and the work that we've been doing, but I really have, we've seen some tremendous progress as well as excitement over this work.
Love to hear. And I'm so appreciative of just naming, as we think about an inside-outside strategy, what being accountable to community actually means and looks like. And I'm curious as you're thinking about some of the impacts that we've already seen occur through the federal work. What is the current policy priorities, and what are your hope for current impacts that I know you just lifted up a few that you'd love to share with us?
Well, thanks, Glenn. I want to start by sharing a little bit more about President Biden's Day One executive order. Beautiful. This set forth a goal to provide everyone with opportunity to reach their full potential, because we know that systemic racism, discrimination, and persistent poverty offend the promise of America and hold all of us back. When we see that a Black family's home is appraised at a lower value simply because of race, or when children in poor urban and rural communities continue to face life-altering health impacts due to lead exposure, we know that we must take action. We need to ensure that everyone can live in dignity and security. With the President's second executive order on equity signed this February, we recommitted to using the full power of the government to forcefully make real the vision of an America that guided all those who came to Washington 60 years ago. This set some concrete deadlines for each of the largest federal agencies. And I also want to highlight the fact that I work with a team specifically devoted to racial justice and equity at the Domestic Policy Council of the White House. Is also historic. We are working to build into every agency's process and muscle memory what it takes to advance an all-of-government effort to promote equity. I'm so pleased to be here with some of our colleagues across the interagency who are truly leading historic commitments that show how far we've come since the March. Let me just share a few more early impacts that we've
Please,
seen
please.
as a result. We have seen the most equitable economic recovery in memory. We have cut child poverty to its lowest rate on record in 2021, including record low Black, Latino, Native American, and rural child poverty. We created over 13 million jobs and brought down unemployment nationwide, in particular for Black and Latino workers, for whom unemployment rates are near 50-year lows. Also, through the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Justice 40, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, and other executive actions, we have championed racial equity in a way that has a tangible impact on underserved communities throughout this nation. During the president's first year in office, more than 90 federal agencies, including all cabinet agencies, released equity action plans, which we know you all have studied carefully, to provide first of their kind roadmaps to address the barriers and discrimination that underserved communities face. And they laid out more than 300 concrete strategies and commitments to address the systemic barriers in our nation's policies and programs and systems. And we know that President Biden has made clear that advancing equity is a generational commitment that will require sustained leadership and partnership with all communities. Thank you.
I heard that, Jenny. Jenny, getting lots of great questions from our attendees, and I'm just, where would you point people to find details on the administration's current work?
Well, we have a number of fact sheets. We can put those in the chat or send them in the back to folks. Also, the whitehouse.gov webpage also has a lot of this information as well. But we can send you some specific resources to share with the group.
I love that. We will make sure we share resources, and I just want to include or encourage our participants today to go to the White House website. The plans are detailed, and I think folks will be both surprised and encouraged by the work that agencies are committed to. And on that note, I do want to ask you a follow-up question, because even as we're doing the work, there's always the challenges of trying to make equity real. And I'm curious, from your vantage point, what are some of the sort of outdated assumptions about racial equity that you have found necessary to challenge? And second, what have you learned from doing this work in terms of taking on some of those challenges?
Well, Glenn, one of the assumptions that I have seen that the president has also confronted is that opportunity is a zero-sum game. Often people think that for someone to have opportunity, it makes taking it from someone else. And something that I have seen through a career focused on equal opportunity is that opportunity benefits all of us, and it really strengthens us as a nation, and it is not a zero-sum proposition. That is an outdated assumption that we're working to challenge with President Biden's equity agenda, because we know that the heart of our shared success as a country is opportunities for all. Using our full talent, providing educational opportunity, job opportunities, and freedoms for all is how we will all succeed as a nation. So today, when a typical Black family has just 1/8 the wealth of the typical white family, we know that corrodes our broader economy. When at least 35% of Americans in rural and tribal communities lack adequate high-speed internet, we know that restricts growth and competitiveness well beyond rural America. One study estimates that racial discrimination has cost the U.S. an estimated $16 trillion over the past 2 decades. Through the implementation of our executive orders on equity alongside our Investing in America agenda, we will continue pushing forward against this outdated assumption. For example, one of the anchors of this administration's equity work is closing the racial wealth gap, including by using the power of federal procurement in our contracting to ensure that more small disadvantaged businesses can tap into the federal contracting marketplace and grow intergenerational wealth through successful small business ownership. The President's second executive order on equity in particular formalizes the President's goal of increasing the share of federal contracting dollars to small disadvantaged businesses from 10% to 15% by 2025. And Glenn, through our work on closing the racial and opportunity gap, we continue to learn more about how this work strongly ties into our broader economic strategy to support small businesses, create new good-paying jobs, increase the resilience of the nation's supply chain, and increase competition in the marketplace. We know that there have been challenges to this work, but we have stood fast to our mission as a federal government to reject narrow, cramped views of American opportunity. We have reaffirmed that every opportunity, that inequality holds all of us back, and that we will continue on the footsteps of those who marched in Washington 6 years ago to advance this view that America is for all of us, opportunity is for all of us, and we must all come together to redouble our efforts so that as the federal government, working in collaboration with all of you, we can bridge the gap that continues to exist between the world we see today and the future we seek for all of us, a future where all Americans can be supported and empowered by the government, a future where we all can deliver resources and benefits equitably and rebuild trust in government. We know that the Supreme Court's recent decision on the consideration of race in college admissions was a big setback, but in response, the President took immediate action to make sure colleges have all the tools they need to choose opportunity over exclusion. The Department of Justice and the Department of Ed have just issued resources that clarify the types of lawful admissions practices that can continue to be undertaken, the need for colleges and universities to really reevaluate what they've done in the past, because there are many opportunities for them to advance diversity and equity across the education space. Ed also convened a national summit on equal opportunity in education, which took place just a couple weeks ago, bringing together universities and other leaders to advance those strategies. And we aren't stopping there. The President also announced a new report that Ed will be working on to identify some of these promising practices. So we are not pulling back, and we are actually moving forward to redouble these commitments and our efforts to advancing equity. And to do so, we know we will need the strength, leadership, and partnership of the entire community to be a part of that fight, and we can't do it without you.
I love that, Jenny. It's a beautiful call to action. And as a partner in the field, want to just acknowledge and appreciate the landmark work that the Biden-Harris administration is engaging in. I know for our attendees, there's a lot of interest in the details of what that means, what it actually looks like, and how they can engage. And we're going to continue on this conversation with a couple of your colleagues. But I wanted to say thank you so much to you for taking the time today to join us, and look forward to having this conversation again in the future as we talk about what that success looks like. And as we engage the broad audience in this call to the moment, and we all know, to And if not now, when? This is the moment for us all to be all in on racial justice and equity. So thank you for joining us today, Jenny. Appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I couldn't agree more, and really appreciate you all hosting this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I want to do, and for our participants, love the questions. Please keep them going. We're about to engage in a deeper conversation about what some of this work actually looks like within agencies. And we are also capturing your questions so that we can follow up and actually try as best we can to answer them if we don't get a chance in today's conversation, and share some of the resources and connections that we hope will be helpful and useful. So with that, let me introduce Carlton Ely. He is our Senior Director for Federal Strategies at Race Forward. He's going to be in a conversation with Matthew Tejada of EPA, followed by a conversation with Janice Fowler of Treasury. With that, Carlton.
Thank you, Glenn, for setting the context for today's discussion. And also, I want to thank you for opening up with Jenny Yang of the Domestic Policy Council. And I just want to say that I'm very excited about building on the conversation that you just had with Jenny. It was wonderful to hear how through the efforts that are happening through the Domestic Policy Council and the White House, they are actually confronting some of those long-standing assumptions that we really need to talk about, helping people to understand that addressing equity doesn't result in a zero-sum game. But as we transition, I want to start by welcoming Matthew Tejada of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Matthew joined EPA in 2013 as the director of the Office of Environmental Justice. And then 10 years later, he is now the Deputy Assistant Administrator within the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. So creation of this new office really is an impressive outcome. It is a tangible example of how sustained strategies inside and outside public institutions can work over time. So Matthew, first I want to say welcome and thank you for participating in today's conversation.
Thank you, Carlton. Happy to be here.
Matthew, the first question I just want to offer is the Office of Environmental Justice has an incredible narrative. In fact, one of the federal statutes that's the cornerstone for environmental justice is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I'm elevating this because the upcoming milestone of the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington may have deeper meaning for the staff who work in the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. So my first question is, could you put into words what the call to action from the March on Washington means for you and other civil servants who are deeply committed to encouraging environmental justice?
I mean, it's thank you, Carlton. I mean, that's a great way to start. It's huge for us. I was actually just visiting with one of the members of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council for lunch earlier today. And we were kind of talking about that. We were visiting about that person's organization and all the challenges they're up to and their promises. And they asked me, you know, how's the staff doing? And frankly, the task we've been given in this administration with such ambition opening up in front of us, both in terms of environmental justice work and civil rights work, has been breathtaking. And then to match that with the resources that have been made available through different appropriations from Congress, it's incredible to the extent that, you know, any logical person would look at this setup and say, well, that's impossible. Like, what are you all out of your mind? This is, you can't go from, you know, the program you've had for so long to literally orders of magnitude increase. And I was sharing that with this person, and they asked, you know, well, how are folks doing? And I said, well, you know, folks are burnt out, folks are frustrated, folks are, you know, working insane hours, but we hold on because this work means so much to the people that work in the EJ and civil rights program at EPA. I mean, EPA is a very purposeful agency to begin with. Most people that work at EPA work here because of the mission of EPA. And everyone that works in EJ and civil rights works in justice and civil rights because it's justice and civil rights. And for those of us that are trying to pull off a next to impossible task right now and making decisions that our families are having to give us some grace on and really just putting everything we have into the opportunity we have before us right now, we connect that to the fact that we're living up to the legacy of our predecessors. We're living up to our ancestors' needs and calls and what they struggled through in their lives. And that's something we actually talk about, you know, when we do get really frustrated here, you know, that we actually are in this incredibly privileged place to take a huge step forward on this path that many before us have started. And so thinking back to, you know, one of the real culminating points of the Civil Rights March and of great leaders on civil rights of the past, like Dr. King and others, it helps to sustain us because we really do see ourselves as part of those histories. You know, and that was something that when I first came to EPA back in 2013, you know, somebody here actually said, you know, Matt, we're not part of the movement. We're in the government. And I didn't argue with that person, but I never really bought it. And now after having been here for 10 years, I very confidently would argue, and I would aggressively argue, the EJ and civil rights program in EPA are part of the movement. We were put here by the movement. We are held accountable by the movement. We are their inside team. And so we are that inside part of the government from and with the movement. So keeping those connections alive and recalling those histories is really important to us.
No, thank you, Matthew. And I want to build on that point in terms of history. I loved your response. Speaking of history, EPA's Office of Environmental Justice is 30 years old. I mean, it was created in 1992. Your office spans 5 political administrations and is well acquainted with the shifts in the political pendulum. As you were talking about privilege, you clearly know what it's like to be in an environment where things are flowing, and you also know what it's like when conditions are ebbing a little bit. So what have been the strategies your office has faithfully employed in order to sustain itself, given the fact that the pendulum does shift back and forth? And sometimes an office may not be resilient in that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think ebbing a little bit is a generous way to put it. We have faced tsunamis and then complete, you know, when the ocean just pulls out so far, you can't even see the shoreline anymore. And one of the things, and again, it took me a minute to kind of understand and then have the courage to really proclaim this after I was hired here. But one of the things that was always tough in the Office of Environmental Justice is, you know, everyone at EPA has a pretty clear role, right? You're an engineer, you're a scientist, you're a lawyer, and you're issuing permits, or you're a compliance investigator, or you're writing rules, or you're doing risk evaluations. Like everyone has, you know, you can kind of hang your hat on some fairly tangible, you know, what are you? What do you do? And that was a question we kind of struggled with in the EJ program for a while, until I finally realized, you know, one of the reasons I was hired was because I was a community-based advocate down in Houston, and I realized, well, we're all just a bunch of advocates, and just because we're inside of government doesn't mean we're not advocates. Like that's what we are. We might have a few different tools that are available to the advocates on the outside, but essentially, you know, our job is still to go through government and try to project the voice of communities into government hallways, into those rooms that are hard to penetrate for citizens, especially those citizens that have been oppressed and marginalized for generations. And that we really have to convince and cajole and develop relationships and provide options and support and guide and teach and train our colleagues across the federal government on how to do their job differently so that it has a beneficial outcome for those communities that have been left behind for so long. And so it's really operating from that place of being an advocate, that now we actually train our staff to be advocates. And part of that is, again, to harken back to, coming up as an advocate in environmental justice down in Texas, you have to be opportunistic. You have to be flexible. You have to be ready to respond at a moment's notice. You have to be able to be ready to strategically retreat and give some things up and be willing to come back to them 4 or 5 years from now. It's just not going to happen right now. In some ways, and I've said this as a joke, I'm going to say it again. Well, not as a joke, but I don't think folks always understand me. Like in good times, like right now, sometimes can be the most confusing for me as an advocate, because I'm like, oh my gosh, like every door just swings open and people are inviting me to tell them how to do their jobs differently. This is so weird, right? It's almost more comfortable for me when we are in one of those times where things are ebbing out, because then it's like, well, that's, you're in for a fight, and what what cards you're holding, where everyone is, what the deal is. That for me goes right back to my earliest days coming up in environmental justice advocacy. But it all comes from and is maintained by, having a focus on the fact that our mission is to support communities, to deliver for communities, and that we really have to focus our efforts on, whatever the opportunity is. And those opportunities have changed drastically, right? But at the end of the day, it's, which opportunities are the ripest to seize in order to advance the ability of EPA and the entire government, other feds, states, local governments, tribes, to be able to deliver environmental public health protection, access to natural resources, a healthy, prosperous future to the communities that have been denied it by the government for so long.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate one of the points that you made when I asked my first question. You noted when you first started with the agency, someone remarked that you understand that you're working for the government, you're not working for the movement. And it really feeds into this next question, which is the fact that racial equity really starts as a personal choice before it becomes an act. And so, for example, civil servants, to your point, may make choices concerning what is within their purview or what may be mission critical. And what I want to ask is, over the span of your career with the US EPA, what compels you to take the position or stand by the position that advancing racial equity is not in conflict with your duties as a civil servant, or to basically take the position that seeing yourself as part of a movement is not in conflict with your duties as a civil servant?
Yeah, I mean, that has been a real tough one for a long time in the federal government. I mean, I was told quite explicitly when I was first hired into this job that we don't talk about environmental racism at EPA. I was told, don't let a journalist trap you into talking about environmental racism. We don't do that here. And I mean, I hadn't even started yet when I was told that. And it really kind of broke my brain. Like, I didn't even know why I was being told that. Like, what am I supposed to, what does that even mean? How, like, I just couldn't compute that. Like, how do you not talk about a reality? But over time, once I got in, it made sense, that we did a lot of hand waving at reality. We didn't really connect histories of oppression or marginalization or genocide in this country, or before this country was a country, to our mission today. And it has really been, this incredible moment in time that we're still living in right now, where not only has there been this societal openness, as hard as it still is, as challenging as it still is, an openness that, really society hasn't been ready for since the 60s, and maybe not even really then to the extent that, it's happening today. Certainly hasn't been that, coming from the White House, right? And for the White House to be so open about, I mean, we've had 4 executive orders on racial equity and environmental justice, right? Those are the first 4 since there was one. And there were over 20 years intervening between those, almost 30 years intervening between those. Like that's incredible, right? And for that to happen again at a time when we have incredible resources flowing through the government, once in a lifetime resources, to be able to make those connections and to be able to honestly speak about history and the persistence of history in determining conditions today and how those conditions will perpetuate into the future if we don't advance equity in this moment with all these resources, if we don't fight for justice to fix those systems and structures that will perpetuate that injustice into the future, is incredibly powerful right now. And it's one of the things that really helps to unlock not only when Administrator Regan, my big boss, when he talks about centering the mission of EPA on environmental justice, it really allows us to unlock what that means, right? That the EPA has done an incredible job since it was founded. I think the EPA has been one of the most, I as a historian myself, I think the EPA has been one of the most successful creations in the history of American governance. If you look back at what the environment was like before 1970, it's a lot different today, but it hasn't been different for everyone. And so being able to talk about why is it not different for everyone and connect it to these longer histories, even though that's still challenging for a lot of folks, it is revelatory in terms of our colleagues here and folks at the state and local level, to connect what we talk about with environmental justice to those histories and to the persistence of decisions made centuries ago to the conditions that people still suffer under today. It really helps to crystallize for folks their personal responsibility in not being offended, like I'm telling them they're doing a bad job, but really being energized at, wow, this environmental justice thing can actually really help me do my job for the folks that need me to do it the most.
Thank you, Matt. I'm mindful of time, and we do want to make sure we get to Janice Bowdler as well. We're going to have to do a part 2 of this conversation, but it's great to see you again. I just want to thank you for your insights as part of this webinar. And please extend my thanks to the staff within the Office of Environmental Justice, as well as the regional environmental justice coordinators, for modeling how to approach your work with love and rigor.
I will tell everyone howdy for you, Carlton. You're always one of us, and we love you.
Love you too, Matt. Thank you.
Bye, buddy.
I now have the pleasure to introduce Janice Bowdler from the U.S. Department of Treasury. Janice is the first counselor to the Secretary for Racial Equity with the Department of Treasury. And prior to her appointment at Treasury, Janice served as president of the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation. For 2 decades, Janice has focused on advancing economic equity solutions for communities of color, breaking down the barriers to underpin the disparities in wealth and financial security by race and gender. So Janice, I'm excited because we're covering the environment, we're covering the economy, and equity. So we're touching on all 3 pillars of sustainability today. So I want to thank you for joining this conversation and making time for us. So Janice,
thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let's start with a basic question. And the question is, why is it important for the Department of Treasury to address racial equity? I want to acknowledge the choice the Department of Transportation has made and give you an opportunity to make the connections.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was really struck as I was listening to Matthew on how long EPA has had this work going. And it's new for Treasury. That's not to say there hasn't been a lot of really amazing work that's happened at the department, but this administration has made a very firm and focused decision to make equity a day one priority. We heard from a lot about that from Jenny. And for the Treasury Department and this Treasury Department under Secretary Yellen, this was a no-brainer. Like, we are in a period of global competitiveness, and having racial inequity in our economy is really money left on the table. Like, we cannot afford as a country not to think about how to tap into communities that still bear the brunt of a history of structural racism, of having been left out of our economy and or suffered at the hands of an extractive economy. Instead, we want to flip that script and say, actually, the path to growth, the path to having an economy that is sustainable over time is when we think about how to bring talent and productivity off of the sidelines. That's how we're going to actually build an economy that works for everyone. And by investing in people and places and infrastructure that have long been overlooked, marginalized, underestimated, that's actually where we're going to see our outsized returns. So I think this Treasury Department, if my secretary were sitting in this seat, she would say this is the most intuitive thing. Of course, we have to focus on equity because it's good for our economy, it's good for our entire country.
Excellent, Janice. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to detail that for not only my benefit, but for the others who are actually taking the time to join today's conversation. Since 2021, President Biden, as we noted earlier, has signed 2 executive orders on racial equity. What opportunities did the Biden executive orders create within the Department of Treasury to adapt existing procedures or either to develop new strategies for centering racial equity when attention was directed to the nation's economic recovery?
Yeah, I mean, let's start there. I know it's painful, but let's all go back to where we were when President Biden took office. We were in the middle of the pandemic. We had historic rates of unemployment. We were at risk of going over a foreclosure and an eviction cliff. And the administration worked quickly with partners in Congress. The president signed the American Rescue Plan into law. And this principle of equity was there from the start. I think it will be common knowledge to people that are listening into our conversation today that, in fact, recoveries have often had what we would call economic scarring, or the long-lasting effects of recessions linger, particularly with communities of color in rural areas where we see, like, we don't make it all the way back from the declines and the losses. And for many communities of color, for many people of color in our businesses, we were just eking back from the Great Recession in 2019, only to have the pandemic hit in 2020. So if we didn't take very decisive steps to think about those most impacted, and in particular with communities of color being hit with the sort of twin hits of a health crisis and an economic crisis, of having the experience of being both the workers that were most likely to lose their jobs and the workers most likely to work in frontline jobs where they were put at health risk. Like, if we didn't center these particular vulnerabilities, then we could have ended up with a very lopsided recovery. In fact, what we have is what we think is one of the most equitable recoveries on record. And we have some really strong data on who is actually served by programs. And I'm really terrible at multitasking, but I am gonna try to quickly drop into the chat so that people, I won't be able to go through all of the stats, but I can drop into the chat where people can go to see the data that shows kind of Treasury's performance on things like the Emergency Rental Assistance Act, the Homeowner Assistance Funds, and the state and local fiscal recovery funds. If you bear with me for just a moment, I'll give you 2 examples of things that Treasury did to make sure that we had really strong outcomes on these programs. So in this case of state and local fiscal recovery funds, we made the decision that for those areas that were hardest hit by COVID, we allowed for more flexibility in how funds were spent. That allowed people who were closest to the ground to be really creative about the sets of solutions that were going to work for them. And that proximity and empowering local leaders is a fundamental tenet of how we exercise racial equity. But we also put in a provision to say, in order to do that, you also have to demonstrate, you have to execute and demonstrate community listening. And so you have to come back to us in your plan how you gathered community input and how that is reflected in how you're spending your funds. And what we know, what we've heard from communities all over the country, is that this requirement, the combination of local empowerment and having this requirement, actually changed the trajectory of how funds were spent and ensured that they came through with a far more degree of cultural competency with nonprofit partners that were close to communities and could get things like COVID resources or job assistance really to the most vulnerable communities. And then you think of something like the Emergency Rental Assistance Act, which has been incredibly successful, I think, in terms of supporting underserved renters of color. As of December 22, and this is in the link, Black families accounted for 42% of assistance, and I somehow lost my note on Latino families, but they're proportionate to the population of renters, which is, I think, pretty remarkable. Extremely low-income renters received received 2/3 of that assistance. And part of the way that we helped make sure that that happened was by going to fact-based proxies. So we could reduce overly burdensome documentation requirements. And we worked specifically with faith institutions, with linguistically competent partners to make sure we got the work out.
No, thank you,
and
Jen.
I'm realizing I dropped the, let me make sure I put the chat in for everyone, the link in for everyone. There we go. I told you I was bad at multitasking.
Well, I know everyone will appreciate seeing the link. I appreciate the way in which you and others are effectively demonstrating that the goals of advancing equity and having a healthy economy aren't mutually exclusive. And this actually leads into my next question. What are the key lessons from this period of economic recovery? And what is the Department of Treasury holding in its messaging about racial equity as attention shifts from recovery to growth?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to drop something else into the chat because there's just, I talk fast, but there's so much to this story. So I think, like my colleagues, and as I think any number of practitioners listening into us would say, I think the trick here, it's not really a trick, right? You have to do the barrier analysis and understand what are the unique barriers for the most vulnerable populations. You need to get proximate and listen to people and then try to execute accordingly. And we're all trying to do that within the bounds of statute and get as creative as we can about how we both fit within our statute while also reaching vulnerable communities. And we have taken what Angela Glover Blackwell termed the curb cut effect to heart. That in fact, when we do that and when we design for the most vulnerable, that's the way we're going to make sure that our programs, our initiatives, our incentives are going to actually benefit the widest number of Americans. I dropped into a chat a recent blog post from the Deputy Secretary that is demonstrating that this approach that we took, while we saw really strong outcomes for historically marginalized groups, we in fact saw strong outcomes across the board, including, for example, poor rural white Americans who also are suffering acutely. And so trying to make sure that as we talk about this, we're saying this approach that we're taking puts us in an evidence-driven approach to getting resources to where they are most needed. And we know when we do that, we are advancing our racial equity goals, we're also benefiting the country at large. And now we have in front of us this suite of once-in-a-generation legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS and Science, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we're trying to take those lessons in to say, now, in this moment, where we have a once-in-a-generation set of investments that is effectively building the middle class of the future, how can we make sure that that middle class is as diverse and representative of our country, that it doesn't leave anybody behind, that we make sure that the economic benefits of investing in our climate resiliency, of modernizing our economy, are not limited to a few, that the good jobs, the contracts, the technology investments flow to our underrepresented communities, to our communities of color, as much as they do anywhere else. So it's that intentionality and the analysis that is really going to get us there.
No, thank you, Janice. And I have one last question for you, and I think this is a good way to wrap up our discussion. Today's webinar is really a reminder that racial equity represents work that needs to happen within agencies, across different levels of government, and with the collaboration of those inside and outside of government. As our nation prepares for the 60th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington, it seems the call to action requires reviving our focus on collaborative problem solving. So what do you look for when attempting to identify good partners and collaborators for your equity initiatives?
It's such a good question. Let me start answering this question by saying that I'm a person who is now, I spent 10 years at National Council of WARESA, now known as Unidos US. I sat in a corporate seat, and now I'm in a government seat. And I promise every mission-driven person on this webinar that you will stretch into the limits of whatever seat you sit in, because each one of these seats has a certain set of tools and levers that it pulls in order to advance this agenda forward. None of us can do it alone. As somebody sitting in federal government right now, I need last mile delivery. I need culturally competent, relevant partners. I need a set of folks that are going to tell me what's really going on the ground. How did our beautifully crafted policies that are so much intentionality, like how are they actually working? How are we making sure that we're collecting the data to know, are we meeting our own aspirations? I have to have that kind of coordinated circular effort. So I think what I haven't really thought of it in that way, like what do I look for in my collaborators to sort of take anybody who will come to us, but the things that I think make us really successful are having the ability to get proximate to communities so that we can do deep listening with those closest to the problem, with the direct lived experience, having the data that then allows us to aggregate those solutions and turn them into policy, and then having the sets of collaborators that really understand how federal, state, and local governments work. We often have blunt instruments. It can be really challenging, but having those partners that can get into the gears and help us rewire is incredibly helpful. If I could say one more thing, Carlton, before we wrap, because I think it fits with this message, but I want to build on a theme that I think I heard my colleagues mention. One of the most important things, I think, when we think about who are we collaborating with, and also like how is our collaboration successful, it really requires us to have a shared understanding of a problem. And I just want to say that we cannot take for granted that we have a shared understanding of the problem. And I think what each one of us does in our seats, which you heard from Jenny and from Matthew, is to be able to go into our particular agencies and articulate that problem in a way that it is of consequence to the mission of our agencies. In my case, we have to understand in a data-driven way the consequences of racial inequity to our national economy. And when we understand it in that way, then we can work backwards on a set of shared solutions. But I think I found sometimes when we all come together and collaborate, we don't actually have a shared understanding of the problem. And I wouldn't want to discount how important that is.
Wonderful, Janice. Thank you so very much. And I want to thank you for the gift of your time and for being a part of today's conversation. And I appreciate your commitment to the necessary work of correcting policies and programs that can impede progress for racial equity. As we start to wrap up today's webinar, I do want to thank Jenny Yang of the Domestic Policy Council. I want to thank Matthew Tejada of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And I want to thank Janice Bowdler of the U.S. Treasury Department for their remarks, for coming together to demonstrate how there are clear programs within the agency that are seasoned and have been working on these issues, and even how new departments are coming to the table, rolling their sleeves up, and they're jumping in with both feet on this work. Today's webinar was organized by the Federal Strategies team at Race Forward. The Federal Strategies team is responsible for implementing a federal initiative to govern for racial equity. In coming months, we look forward to announcing future programming that's associated with this series. As we conclude, I leave you with the reminder that the call to action continues. If you've been working on racial equity for many years at the federal level, we applaud your trailblazing work and your unwavering commitment. If you're new to working on racial equity at the federal level, then we invite you to be part of an emerging community of practice. But wherever you fall on the spectrum, always remember the importance of being bold, to being curious, as well as to being mindful, because the public is relying on us to move beyond our comfort zones. So thank you for taking the moment to join us today, and we look forward to working with you in solidarity.